promoting the idea of a nuclear program in Japan saw it as a kind of way to salve our conscience over the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we said, we'll be really generous and give them a 60,000 megawatt reactor. And the AEC Commissioner Thomas Murray said, now while the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains so vivid, construction of such a power plant in a country like Japan would be a dramatic and Christian gesture which could lift all of us far above the recollection of the carnage of those cities. This is the arrogance of the nuclear thing coming to the fore already in the 50s. The Washington Post, in an editorial, said that Murray's idea was a great idea because it would, quote, divert the mind of man from his present obsession with the armaments race, which, of course, you know it didn't. And it went on to say, many Americans are now aware that the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan was not necessary. How better to make a contribution to amends than by offering Japan the means for the peaceful utilization of atomic energy? How better indeed to dispel the impression in Asia that the United States regards Orientals merely as nuclear cannon fodder. Well, you know, back then it was a different time, and they really did see nuclear energy as the great way forward. To the Japanese, it was a extremely tempting possibility because they were loved to be at the cutting edge of technology. They were totally dependent for their oil and natural gas and coal and minerals on imports. So they saw this as a way of granting themselves energy independence or energy self-reliance. But then the story goes on from there. It's kind of interesting. We had the U.S. Information Service and the CIA was running a promotion in Japan. They set up a traveling exhibit. And they found this guy called Matsutaro Shiriki, who was a former Class A war criminal who got released after 2 years imprisonment because, I guess, what I've read, I mean, I haven't had a chance to really delve into his history, but apparently it was because he was very anti-communist. He also loved baseball, two things that made him really favorable in our eyes. I don't think the guy knew anything about physics or nuclear physics, but he was apparently made the first atomic energy commissioner, the first atomic energy minister in Japan. And so he was very much in on the beginning of Japan's nuclear program. And then I'm going to fast forward ahead. And in 1974, they were running into opposition from unions and fishermen and farmers and things like that. So they had to find a way of, they knew they wanted to site these reactors in more rural areas, away from big cities like Tokyo and Osaka and Kyoto. So they would put them in these kind of more rural areas. And they passed this bill called the Three Power Source Development Laws in 1974, which set up a means to both charge consumers for, it was like a nuclear tax, and this money was used it was funneled to these communities. So they basically got, you probably read this in the New York Times a few weeks ago, they got, this was the answer for me, I'd never really understood this, but this article explained that they use this money to build indoor swimming pools, tracks, libraries, big public works projects, and this became kind of a secondary economy in these communities. So it became very sort of not the thing to do to protest against nuclear, and people that did were kind of shunned or sort of looked at like they were a little weird, because life was good. And so between 1963 and 2009, Japan built 60 reactors. And it is, I don't need to remind you, on a major, at the intersection of three tectonic plates, right kind of near Tokyo. So in the process, there was this, as I sort of was explaining before, this cozy, incestuous relationship between the utilities and their regulators and the industry, with people moving, in a revolving door between all three of these sectors, which is not dissimilar to what happens in other countries. But, it went on there in a kind of very intense way. One lawmaker who did speak out against nuclear said everyone considered that to speak out against nuclear was a taboo, so nobody wanted to touch it. And he said it was all about money. Now, for many years, seismologists in Japan and the nuclear industry in Japan knew that a quote, big one was coming. The newsletter I edit, Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, I've been hearing this from our correspondent in Tokyo since our newsletter started in 2007. He kept, every time there'd be an earthquake and a reactor would shut down, he kept referring to the big one. And it wasn't until after Fukushima, and I really focused on it a lot more, that I realized that they were thinking that it would happen near this Hamaoka reactor, which has since been shut down by the government after Fukushima. Instead, it happened nearer these Fukushima, Daiichi, and Daini plants. But in 2004, TEPCO engineers were speaking at a conference in Miami, and there they warned that the Fukushima Daiichi plant had a 10% chance of being tested or overrun by a tsunami in the next 50 years. Maybe they were a little bit liberal in their, or conservative in their estimate, or liberal depending on how you want to look at it. But they were, the reason they came up with that, and they had actually bothered to study it, was they were worried about they'd watched what happened during the Indonesia quake and tsunami a few years earlier. At the same month that they issued that warning, another plant owned by TEPCO, which is the biggest nuclear plant in the world with 7 reactors, it's called the Kashiwazaki Karawa plant, was shut down in July of 2007 because there was a 6.8 magnitude earthquake. That cost TEPCO a lot of money. It was in the red. It's only just before Fukushima had started making a profit again. But, I mean, in the first fiscal year after that earthquake, it lost something like $5 billion. A lot of that was in replacement fuel costs. So, every time there would be these earthquakes, you would think that they would be thinking about, maybe we should just build up that wall a little more. Maybe we should, but they didn't. They were just very cavalier. By the way, in 2002, when it was discovered that they'd been lying and falsifying records and all these horrible things, the president and CEO of TEPCO resigned. But a short while later, he was made an advisor to the company. That just shows you how business just went on like they were in their own zone. Anyway, so March 11th happens. It was a Friday. And I was thinking, oh, I can't wait for the weekend, because our newsletter deadline is on a Monday, so I was sort of coasting into the weekend thinking, all our stories are lined up, this is great. And then my colleague in London calls and says, there's been this terrible earthquake in Japan. I said, oh my God. So you're going from this sort of slowing down mode to going into full gear, and I don't think I stopped for the next month. I think I just was in a complete zone. But it was very hard to tell that first Friday how severe it was. I mean, if you looked at the TEPCO press releases, they were one page, they were tiny little type, and they were enigmatic, to put it mildly. They just said the automatic shutdown, and that's it. And finally, by March 12th, which was a Saturday, they started talking about loss of offsite power and stuff like that. But they weren't saying, at least in those first few press releases. I will tell you a funny anecdote. The next morning, I get this phone call. The dog woke me up, and it was 6:45 in the morning. I hadn't even brushed my teeth, and it was ABC nationwide radio. I had never done a radio interview because most people, nuclear just wasn't a sexy subject. So I was like, oh my God, okay, well, could you send me some information because I've been sleeping and I don't know what's happened overnight. And I'm on this nationwide radio program, and he's asking me, what do I think's happening and all this. Well, I was on with some really smart-sounding nuclear engineer from Berkeley, who was obviously very pro-nuclear, and who was trying to reassure, because I managed to listen to it 3 or 4 weeks later, and he said, I want to reassure your listeners that TEPCO is doing all the right things. I'm very sure of that, and this is a very difficult situation, but it's not going to be that serious. And he actually said these words, this is going to be 3 Mile Island gone right. Which, and I was sitting like, kind of not awake yet, and I was like, well, how does he know that, And Finally, I just say to this guy, look, I can't say for sure what's happening, but I can tell you, I bet you anything last night was the night from hell for those guys at that reactor. And my experience with accidents from researching and also from covering them is that they always underestimate the severity in the first few hours and days of an accident. They always underestimate. They downplay it, and they do everything to assure you that everything's okay. They're like Pangloss in Candide. I mean, it's, you know, it's so that was my first day, and then it went on from there, and it was pretty crazy. So you all know the story. I think I won't recount what happened, the 3 explosions within, I think, about 4 days, and hydrogen explosions. And I'll get to later what TEPCO now admits. But anyway, we're hearing from TEPCO for the first month that they don't admit to meltdowns. They downplay the severity of the releases. They keep the evacuation zone to, is it 20 kilometers? I always get the kilometers.
I think the 20 kilometers.
12
miles.
12 miles, that's right. I get them mixed up. Anyway, it's 20 kilometers. And you know, then there's this whole big thing about spent fuel pools and whether a spent fuel pool caused the hydrogen burst in reactor number 4. And so everybody, all the media goes to, I got called by PBS of all places to come in and talk about spent fuel pools. And I found, you know, it was just incredible that the media was focusing on this level of detail about the nuclear industry. It was good, but, you know, it should be focused on a lot more because it's the most dangerous technology we have. And if it goes awry, you know, anybody living within the vicinity of a bad explosion or a fire, a spent fuel pool fire, might lose their home forever. So it should be something that people pay a lot more attention to and demand much higher levels of safety and vigilance by the regulators as long as we have these things around. Anyway, so Germany, you know by now, shut down its 7 oldest reactors and then later decided they were going to rescind this reactor life extension. They are now back to the 2022 shutdown of all reactors. This has caused a big furor in the industry. Switzerland, that had been going nuclear before, is following suit. Italy, it looks like there's no chance of a nuclear reactor there, even though before there was going to be a referendum and they were sort of talking favorably about it. China is slowing. They're having a safety review, and there are people, the Chinese situation is just fascinating because it is not unlike a lot of people think that it's this, you know, everything comes down from Beijing. Actually, there's quite a lot of, I don't know how to say it, but it's a fluid situation. And there are people in China that I'm convinced are very concerned about safety, but they are perhaps in the bureaucratic system not coming to the fore all the time, and there's juggling between those people and the people that are promoting the development of nuclear power. It's the same thing that goes on in every country. The people that are concerned about safety versus the people that are promoting and pushing. And that struggle is going on in China, and we're watching it very closely. But there is a bit of a slowdown, and but they are, you know, they're going to carry on with their construction. Now, in Japan, I'm going to take it down to for a moment. I want you to consider what's going on with the actual people that are affected by this accident. And I'll just tell you a couple of, one is from a blog post that I found absolutely riveting, fascinating, because it's written by somebody who's obviously extremely intelligent. But the first thing that struck me was a Washington Post article about some farmers that live in a village right outside the evacuation zone where they were told to stay indoors. And these farmers, the husband of the couple said, stay indoors. What do they mean, stay indoors? What am I supposed to do with my cows? They're all outside and I have to feed them. And, you know, you kind of wonder, what are these people thinking? That these people, and they don't leave. A lot of that village evacuated, but they don't because they had spent a lifetime building up a very successful dairy farm with some of that very fancy Japanese, you know, those beef cows. And these people, their lives as they know it are pretty much wrecked because even, you know, if they test, let's hope that when they test on their farm, they got spared. But they're around an area where there's a lot of radiation.